presentation is called Chasing the Biggest Bang, and it's about how you can improve efficiency and increase profitability in the face of these insane increases in input costs. And so part of what was the last third of the second presentation covered several strategies, including foliar fertilising, but several strategies relative to exactly that thing. So it seemed like a crime to leave them out, so we'll go through and talk about them. You heard me mention a strategy we use with leaf testing called the Big Four, and I mentioned luxury levels, chasing luxury levels on a leaf test. We're looking at a test here that's relative to ryegrass, for example, and the Big Four, if you recall, were phosphorus, calcium, magnesium and boron. And so when we talk about a luxury level, in this scenario, if we look at phosphorus, we're looking at a range of between 0.2 and 0.5 that we need for this ryegrass crop, and a luxury level is 0.5 or 0.49. So on our what we call plant therapy tests, where we've got all of the guidelines for the different stages of about 250 crops, and they get translated through to the simple chart so you can see where you stand, phosphorus needs to be up here. That's a Big Four mineral. We mentioned the reasons for the Big Four phenomenon. All four of those minerals are intimately related to the most important of all functions, photosynthesis. Understanding the very simple thing that 95% of everything you grow comes from photosynthesis. So obviously if you can manage that and look at strategies relative to improving that most important function, it's going to be good for your back pocket at the end of the season. So phosphorus needs to be 0.5, calcium 0.2 to 0.6, we want 0.6 or 0.59 or somewhere up the top end of the charts, we want it here. Magnesium 0.4, 1.14 at the moment, way off the mark, but we want it up here, so it's just under a third of where it needs to be. And boron, lowly boron, the surprise inclusion in the Big Four, but of course intimately related to whether calcium works or not, and also a big player in the fruit to flower ratio and nitrogen fixation and a whole range of other things where it's so neglected in broadacre crops and it really needs to be addressed. And on tissue tests we find, as we mentioned, we would aim for 15 parts per million, so we want to be up here somewhere. Now, the reason that I was the first, I think, that I know of to come up with the concept of micronized minerals was specific to this Big Four problem, because basically we're saying, okay, we need some calcium, what do we got? Well, we've got calcium nitrate in terms of soluble calciums, and we don't need more nitrogen. And that's really common, particularly in intensive horticulture, but increasingly in broadacre scenarios where you don't want more of this. This is toxic, and it's going to shut down things and affect all kinds of things to put more nitrogen into this equation. So how are you going to play the Big Four game midway through the season? Because this is a leaf test and you haven't got fertigation in this scenario. And that's where I thought, well, what other choices are there? What would happen if you took limestone at 40% calcium instead of 18% calcium and cal nitrate, and no unwanted tag-ons, and you micronise that down with ball rollers right down to 5 parts per million, would it be uptaken? Yeah, it is, and quite efficiently. And we found we could get 1.1 kilos into a litre. It makes it bloody heavy. It's over 30 kilos a 20-litre drum. In fact, we can't put 1,000 litres into 1,000-litre shuttles. We only do 800 because it flips tractors. It's too heavy. But you've got 44% calcium and just calcium, and that allows you the luxury of lifting calcium by itself. Magnesium, what do you got? Well, you've got mag sulfate and mag nitrate. Well, mag nitrate's not going to work, and mag sulfate isn't appropriate in this scenario, and that's common to see that scenario. So what else can you use? Well, mag sulfate and mag nitrate are 10% magnesium. Magnesium carbonate is 28%. What would happen if you micronized that down to this tiny, tiny particle size? And we did, and we get 28% magnesium, almost 3 times as much. And you can play the Big Four game in terms of lifting magnesium with a high analysis source that doesn't have any unwanted tag-ons. And then you can do things like calcium and magnesium together. You can micronise dolomite, and a very popular product for us in the 57 countries to which we export is a product that's based on micronized guano, because you're doing phosphorus and calcium and a whole bunch of other trace minerals in that guano, including 25% silica that's available when you micronize it down to that level. So that's micronized guano, which you can liquid inject. Wonderful to put on seed because you've got the phosphorus calcium, available phosphorus calcium, which are integral to an effective seed treatment. So, and what about boron? Well, you're just going to use soluble, always with humic acid. You never use boron without a little bit of humic acid. in the equation. That creates a boron humate. One of the very much researched phenomenon associated with humic and fulvic acid, both capable of the same thing, is something called cell sensitization, where basically you increase the permeability of the cell membrane and you increase uptake by between 30 and 34%. So in this scenario, you're going to have a much better uptake of boron. Why before flowering? Why would you? Every crop, I very rarely see exceptions. There are exceptions. I mean, there can be accumulations in hard pans and so forth of boron, but it's not very common in my experience. And we see when we're doing tissue tests that almost everyone needs boron, and that critical before flowering foliar spray, 1 kilo of soluble and a few litres of what I call it do-it-yourself humic acid, where you take a kilo of soluble humic acid granules, in 10 litres of water, you make your own 1,000-litre shuttle or whatever you want to do with 100 kilos in 1,000 litres. Dissolve it, leave it sit for a day. There's a sludge, because it's insoluble. You can pay much more for a fully soluble one. That sludge is wonderful, wonderful stuff. Now, when we talk about humates, we're talking humic acid, fulvic acid, and a third component called humans. Now, we're talking about trees that predated the dinosaur era that contained the full spectrum of 74 minerals, and those minerals are not found in the humic and fulvic acid fraction. They're plant growth stimulants and biostimulants, very powerful microbial stimulants, but they don't contain much mineralisation. The minerals are in the insoluble portion called humans, and that's what the sludge is on the bottom of your tank. You do not toss that out at the end of the season or when you finish that tank. If you have a veggie garden, and everyone should have, because I consider a vegetable garden to be the ultimate wellness tool for yourself and your family. There is nothing more important than your health than a vegetable garden. And you say, why is that? I can buy. Well, aside from the fact that you're going to grow it with some compost and some lime and some nutrition and perhaps put some biology in, then you're going to grow stuff without chemicals, which is a nice thing for you and your family, but you've got the luxury of eating that food directly out of the garden. And people have no understanding of the loss of nutrition associated with how long it's been stored. Now, you can take something like a snow pea, in 12 hours, you've lost 50% of the vitamin C in a snow pea. Now, you're eating snow peas that are 5, 6, 7 days old in a shop. Sweet corn is the fastest known loser of nutrition, and it loses 40% of its nutrition in the first 20 minutes after harvest. So you grow your sweet corn in your garden and you boil your water beforehand and you put some good mineralised mountain salt and you walk out there and pluck it and drop it in there for 7 to 9 minutes and pull it out and smother it in butter, and oh my God, you've eaten the best sweet corn you will ever eat in your life. And that's the champagne food. And you don't pick and make your salad and then say, oh, I'll keep it for the next 4 days. It's the luxury of eating that stuff fresh. I drive up my drive, I've got all these vegetable plots on the way up, and I stop and pluck what I'm going to eat for that salad for that day, and then the chooks get the rest, because you've got the luxury of doing that. There's nothing better for you than eating food at its maximum nutrition and freshness. But anyway, I'm digressing already and I can't afford to. So basically, now this is the sad part of the story, because 30% of the thousands upon thousands of leaf tests that we look at on a yearly basis look like this. And this person is not having fun farming, I can promise you that. They're saying, oh my God, this is a hard road, it's raining, you've got the fungicides lined up at the door, they're washing off as soon as you put them on. You know, if you're growing a tomato crop or something, how fast alternaria can spread through there in those wet conditions, and the fungicides won't stick, and you're coming in twice a day in some instances, and you're not sleeping at night with that rain on the roof. That whole story, this is going to be your lot when the 4 most important minerals for the most important process are all deficient, and that's 1 in 3 leaf tests globally. It's a tragedy, because it's the most important profession on the planet and you're not enjoying it when you look like, and you don't know why. Now you do know why. That's why leaf tests are particularly important. We're going to talk about the importance of precision nutrition, and I consider it hugely important to have the capacity to have a little bit of in-field monitoring, and we'll talk about how you might use these tools. Now, we've talked about the refractometer. We mentioned basically you're squeezing a little bit of sap from the plant, usually choosing the first fully developed leaf, which is the leaf used for leaf analysis, of course. It seems to be the standard, and you're measuring the refractive index of the leaf, of the plant. It's not fruit, it's the leaf that you're testing. The light refracts through the dissolved solids in that plant sap, and you're measuring your skills as a nutrient manager and a chlorophyll manager, literally. The Brix test is telling you how good a grower you are. The higher the Brix level is what that measure of dissolved solids is called, the more yield potential, the less disease pressure, the more fun you're going to have farming that crop. So it's a simple guideline, $60 metre of immense value, and it tells you more than just nutrient density. We'll talk about one of the second major roles of a refractometer is this use as a calcium monitor. Now, understand how important calcium is. Calcium, the trucker of all minerals. Probably the most important. If you talk NPK versus calcium, calcium's probably number one. It's hugely important in our health, in animal health, soil health, and microbial health for multiple reasons I won't go into. But your refractometer, this is what you're looking for when you're looking at the 0 to 32 Brix axis up the middle, the two halves of the hemisphere, not always blue and yellow, sometimes different shades of green depending on the crop. But where the two axes, the two hemispheres meet, is the Brix level. So you can see here roughly it's somewhere around 12 and 13, about 12. But the good news is that you've got this fuzzy line, and that's what you're chasing. That's an indication of a nutrient density specifically linked to calcium. It correlates quite reliably with a calcium meter, and it really is a good guideline as to, and you don't want to be looking at this. You will have a low Brix level when you have that sharp distinction because you're lacking calcium, the trucker of all minerals that determines calcium is calcium and phosphorus, the two most important of several minerals responsible for lifting Brix levels for that whole process of photosynthesis. And this is low calcium, and you don't want to see this. And so immediately you say, okay, I've got to come in and do something, and the simplest thing is just a couple of kilos of cal nitrate with some fulvic acid if you're not certified organic, and you put that out and watch the fuzz come back into the system. So that's really important. It's a calcium meter. You can measure boron deficiency. How does that work? Well, basically one of the multiple roles of boron is at the end of a day at 4:30, 4:45, the plant begins to translate the sugars made in the little sugar factories called chloroplasts. And there's the equivalent of a little trapdoor that opens to allow that translocation. And that trapdoor is governed by boron. Now, a very simple test you can do in the paddock, and it literally takes a minute to do a refractometer test, is to measure that test late in the afternoon. I always measure it about 4:30 because I want the highest Brix on my crops. So I feel good about myself because that's going to be the highest Brix always because you've photosynthesized, and sugar is part of what you're measuring in terms of those dissolved solids. So the plant then begins pumping half of those sugars down to the roots, and of course 60% of that half is given away to the microorganisms. But so how you can check, and it can be used as something of a boron meter, is that you're measuring late in the afternoon, let's say 4:35, and your Brix level might be 12. Well, next morning it needs to be 9 or perhaps 10 because you've translocated those sugars, and that's part of what you're measuring. So you always got to see this drop first thing in the morning. And if you measure next morning and it's 12 still, you've got a problem. And there can be other things involved, but most commonly that's a lack of boron. And it's quite serious if you understand the equation and the importance of trace minerals relative to microorganisms. If you're crowded around the root waiting for your daily feed of sugar, and that sugar just stops because you constipated the plant by basically trapping those sugars in the leaf through a lack of boron, the wheels start falling off shortly thereafter because you've stopped the whole process of I look after you, you look after me, has just ground to a halt. So you can understand the importance and the reason not to neglect boron in that scenario. And you can check the suitability of inputs. You can say, did this work? Did I get a significant Brix increase following a foliar spray or a microbial input or whatever? The high Brix crops are going to have greater density, higher nutritional value. They'll weigh more. A high Brix crop always has more density and will weigh more, which is good if it's something you're selling. And it will have the lower levels of nitrates because one of the principal reasons for low Brix levels is high nitrate levels. In fact, it's impossible to have this with high nitrates because nitrates are uptaken always with water. The plant doesn't differentiate. If it says, I'm having that nitrates, it's the most abundant mineral in the plant, it wants it, and it takes it up with water. And if there's lots of it there, because of your big urea dose that turned into a nitrate, it goes in with water and dilutes everything else, and the Brix levels drop accordingly, and the insects say, yes, you beauty, and come and perform their role in the scheme of things, the garbage collectors that take out the garbage that you just produced. So that's how the deal works, and the refractometer is invaluable in terms of monitoring that process and how good you're doing. Now, The SAP pH meter is a friend of mine who's no longer with us, a US researcher called Bruce Tanio. Got a wonderful range of microbial products that he makes in the US, but he was something special. And he discovered this concept of SAP pH where you use a specialised meter made by Hariba in Japan. And little well, you take 3 drops, ideally from the same material that you just put in your refractometer, and you run it across the 2 points inside that little well. It's literally just 3 drops. There's a little calibrating fluid you put in, and a smiley face comes up and says, yeah, we're calibrated, and then you measure SAP pH. And what the story is that at 6.4, you do not have fungal disease. Now, I've walked the fields of many, many countries over quite a few years since I discovered this, and I've talked to many, many consultants who work in this field, and none of us have ever seen a plant with a fungal disease at 6.4. If you've got a fungal disease, you can guarantee that you've got low SAP pH. And then you say, well, why is that? What's the link to low SAP? Well, it's the same story as low soil pH. pH is relative to the soil sweetening minerals, the alkalizing minerals, potassium, sodium, magnesium, and calcium. And so it's one of those 4 that's going to be at, and it might be more than one of those 4. Now, interestingly, if you were to test your saliva or urine, urine saliva, it should be 6.4 first thing in the morning, and many of you will not have a urine pH of 6.4. And the finding in a study of 18,222 cancer patients 6 years ago in the US was that all of them, every last one of them, had acidic urine. So it's quite a guideline as to your relative resilience. And what's the reason for it? Well, there can be multiple reasons. There can be stress, there can be overconsumption of refined carbohydrates, it's very acidifying, wheat particularly, super acidifying. You can swap to spelt, the only truly alkalizing grain, for example. But most importantly, it's your balance between alkalizing minerals and acid-forming minerals. So where do alkalizing minerals come from? They come from fruit and vegetables. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium are found in very large amounts in vegetables and fruit. And where do the acid-forming minerals, and what are they? They're sulfur, sulfuric acid, and phosphorus, phosphoric acid. They're the 2 acid-forming minerals. And where do they come from? They come from meat. I'm not saying you can't eat meat, but how's your balance between the amount of meat you eat or protein you eat versus the amount of fruit and vegetables to balance it out? Now, you can go to South Africa, where they're the greatest meat eaters in the country, where they consider eggs to be vegetables. They're just insane protein eaters, huge steaks, but their blood pressures, because we do this as part of the health monitoring for 5-day courses, are these insane figures of 200 over 100, just insane figures, and they're around the 4s and 4.5s, and this is just a complete imbalance, which shortens their life. They've actually got substantially shorter life than us, the Boer farmers, in terms of lifespan. But anyway, it's digressing yet again. So SAP pH. So can we use these tools in the process of exclusion to identify exactly what's lacking? If we know we've got low SAP pH, we're going to have if you've got a SAP pH of 4.8, I will promise you that you will have every fungal disease and a dog turn up to party. That's just the deal. You created the environment, the terroir, as they call it, for those disease organisms to proliferate. So you want to find out what it is. What am I short of? So you've measured your SAP pH. Say it's 5.2 for argument's sake. It needs to be 6.4. So we know it's calcium, magnesium, potassium, or sodium. Usually not sodium, sometimes, but very, very rarely. So really it's just 3 minerals we're trying to figure which it is. So the same drops from the same plant. You can usually get quite a few drops out of a decent well full, garlic crusher filled with the plant material. You squeeze that now onto your refractometer, hold it up, and it's got that picture we just showed you with the fuzzy line. What does that mean? You've got plenty of calcium, so calcium's out of the equation. You know it's calcium, magnesium, or potassium, you've got 2 minerals left. Then you take your potassium meter, which same company, looks the same, just a different colour. Put a few drops in there. You've got guidelines for where you need to be. It might be during the vegetative period. You need to be 2,500 parts per million, and you're 2,007, so you know it's not potassium. What is it? It's magnesium. So you put out some magnesium sulfate with a bit of fulvic acid, foliar spray it, and watch the SAP pH rise up, and you can monitor it, of course, and your pressure dissolve. So it's a really good hands-on strategy for what you can achieve. So the other usage of both nitrogen and potassium meters, nitrogen, of course, is about finding the sweet spot. Now, we know that we're abusing nitrogen on so many occasions. We know that we're 80% of all the nitrous dioxide, 310 times more thickening of that blanket. We need to lift our game seriously in the face of the greatest challenge we've ever faced, and we're big contributors. And so nitrogen management and improving nitrogen management is just a huge story, and a nitrogen meter can be invaluable in that context. Now, the things that we find that your ideal and most productive level, and you can cross-reference with the other tools. Where's my bricks highest? Where's my crop looking the best? Where are the roots looking the best? Where's my sap pH at its best? And you can tie that into a tissue test if you want, but that's where nitrogen's my sweet spot. And that's what you go for. You don't go more, you don't go less. And you'll find that that sweet spot becomes significantly less from flowering onwards, where potassium takes over. So you can do it with monitoring and having your parts per million, or you can just monitor it when you choose by doing top leaf, bottom leaf. We're talking about the second most mobile, potassium being the most mobile of all minerals, rushes from the lower leaves up to the top leaves, or to the growing head or the growing fruit. And you're measuring those top leaves with a tissue test, and it's totally unreliable for potassium because you're measuring where it went to. And by the time the entire plant is drained, and you say, I'm potassium deficient, you can't catch up. You can play some catch up, but you lost yield. You're talking about the money mineral that governs the size of things. So having a technique where you can do top leaf, bottom leaf, and they need to be the same, and the moment there's 10% lower on the bottom leaf, you've got a deficiency and you come in and do something, that's a game changer. It's one of the biggest yield profit builders of all the things I teach. Because you can come, and you know the story, you've got a dry finish. Potassium's super mobile. It's not part of any cell. It runs between cells. You cut your hay, it rains, the potassium's in the soil. It is so mobile, it's ridiculous. And, sorry, just have a mouthful of water. You all know the story. Well, you will know the story if you've got a potassium meter, because you're monitoring the plant flowers. 5 days later, 2,500, a nice reading, becomes 900. There is such a potassium drawdown from flowering onwards, and you don't know that a lot of the time, and then you get the dreaded dry finish. Potassium is not something that's part of the cell wall like calcium. Potassium basically is taken from soil solution, and there's no soil solution, you've got no potassium. That's what the dry finish is, and that's costly. And having a meter to say, do I need to come in and fix this, is just, I can't even put a price on what that's worth. So nitrogen, potassium, and nitrogen, second most mobile, same story. Top leaf, bottom leaf, do I need nitrogen? They need to be the same. So it's real simple, and it's really, really effective. I get emails from all over the world, people saying, oh my God, that simple thing I heard in your podcast, that's a game changer. And it is. It can be a real game changer. So that's just the nitrogen meter and finding the sweet spot, where it's going to be. It's going to be different during vegetative, different after flowering. And the potassium meter, probably most valuable because this is the money mineral. And of course, what happens when potassium leaves that lower leaf? Well, what happens is it's superalkalizing mineral, and the lower leaf drops in sap pH. And where do you get, say, let's look at a calcium-hungry crop like, say, capsicum tomatoes. That whole family, eggplants, all part of the same family, huge potassium users. And what happens when you've run out of potassium and didn't know it? Potassium moves out, the sap pH drops, and then comes Alternaria, the largest killer of tomatoes. That's where it came from. This is getting back to root causes of understanding. It's not an accident, it's not a deficiency of a fungicide when you get a fungal disease. I better keep moving. So 10%. Now, some of the intensive guys, like say strawberries, fully productive for 3 months, they like to have higher levels, but maybe 25% higher potassium in the lower leaf, and that's a reserve. So that's another way to consider it in more intensive cropping. So we're going to talk, before we start on this new presentation, so I better keep moving, about foliar, because if we're going to talk about chasing the biggest bang, this is one of the ways we can do it. So we're going to talk about how you can achieve the best foliar response. For those of you who are foliar spraying, or those of you who are thinking about it, I'll give you a few tips. So one of those is the concept of you're brewing any kind of microbial input, including just simple things like worm extracts or whatever, you never put them out by themselves. It's just this tremendous wasted opportunity, because we're talking about a phenomenon called putting the microbes behind the minerals. Now, when we go back to human health, which I consistently will do, all of us, as I mentioned, should be taking zinc last thing before bed. But even better, and it's not just zinc, it's any supplement, is the finding that taking a probiotic with a supplement increases the uptake of that supplement by 45%. That's the same deal. That's putting the microbes behind the minerals. And what we see, and if we want to understand how that's working, one of the phenomenon at play here, particularly in a foliar scenario, is that the stomate opens and can open up to 7 times its normal size. And one of the things that governs that stomatal opening is a sudden influx of CO2. And what do you think you're doing when you spray out a microbial with 5 billion organisms in a teaspoon that land on the leaf, all of them sucking in oxygen and breathing out CO2? That, my friends, is a sudden influx of CO2. And the stomate says, yeah, I'm having that, and you've got some nutrition with it, and it comes so beautifully. That's putting the microbes behind the minerals. A lot of it's just common sense, but a lot of people haven't thought about it. So, yeah, huge, never put out anything. I call it microbially enhanced nutrient delivery. In fact, I've patented that term globally, and we use it on brand names and some of our things. So, a few other do-it-yourself foliar strategies. Humic acid, as we've heard people mention, they're using fulvic, which is more expensive. The problem with humic acid is this weird acid that's only soluble in alkaline conditions, which means most of our inputs are acidic, and so there's very few things that you can directly combine. It's okay with the granules because it doesn't matter, they dissolve and you create a phosphate humate or a urea humate and stabilise those fertilisers. But in liquid form, you're shoveling out the bottom of your tank and you haven't got a smile on your face at that point. Because that's what you've got, Vegemite, when you put anything acidic, which is everything. All the sulfate-based trace minerals, all of the nitrates are based on nitric acid. They're all very acidic. Calcium nitrate, 2.9 pH, and that just drops it out of solution. So that's fulvic is compatible. It's a genuine acid that's compatible with everything, does very similar things. It's just that humic's cheaper. But humic is compatible with urea, and it's compatible with boron. So wonderful foliar spray of urea and boron before flowering, because the amine form's particularly required at that point. So that's a really nice concept and works really well. And of course, it's cheaper than fulvic, and humic's got all its own benefits on top of that. The combination of citric acid with farm chemicals we mentioned. Every shed, in my opinion, should have a bag of citric acid. It's the cheapest way and most effective way and most beneficial way of dropping pH to create the ideal pH for your chemicals if you're using them. And you're welcome to email me. And in fact, I might just send it through to you guys, the 5-page chart of independent research, not our research, US research, of not all chemicals, but a huge range of them and their sweet spot. And it is such a play. I mentioned diethane, 5.2, 18 days half-life, that's the sweet spot for that, which is a month of protection with that fungicide, and a pH 7, which is just a neutral pH, 18 hours. A day and a half. That's how important it can be. That's the most dramatic example of it. But every chemical has a sweet spot. And if you know that, you use the citric acid, 100 grams per 100 litres, drops 1 pH point, roughly, as a guideline. You need a pH meter to be sure. But glyphosate, 2.9, who would have thought, is the sweet spot for glyphosate. And watch what happens when you get down there. And it needs 300 or 400 grams, depending on your starting point, of citric acid to get there, but watch what happens to your glyphosate requirements when you get down to that sweet spot pH. You will be pleasantly surprised. The combination of, so chelation, what is chelation? Why don't you look out there and say I'm a zinc deficient because you know your crop. So I'll put some zinc sulfate out. I'll put a kilo of zinc sulfate, just a couple of bucks or less. I'll foliar spray that out. Why do people not do that? Why do people spend many times more that amount on chelated trace minerals? What's chelation mean? What is it? The word chelate means claw in Greek. And a very simple thing is when you take the zinc sulfate, it's a positively charged cation. The leaf surface, in fact the entire plant, is very strongly negatively charged. You're aiming for the little pore on the underside of the leaves when you foliar spray. That's where the main entry point is through that stomate. And you've sprayed your positively charged zinc and it rushes to that tiny hole and you get this super inefficiency. You get this clogging of that pore and you're getting maybe of the 35.2% zinc and zinc sulfate monohydrate, you get about 8%. And then it's clogged and you don't get it in there. So what chelation does, the claw wraps around the zinc, neutralises the charge, and then it goes with no traffic jam. That's a real simple explanation, but it's basically what it is. as far as chelation goes. So you can pay for EDTA chelation, and EDTA chelation, of course, the patented form of chelation, is quite expensive, but more importantly, it's now recently, in fact last year, been listed as a POP. What's a POP? A persistent organic pollutant. It doesn't break down. It's been shown to grab other things and tie them up, to grab things within the plant and tie them up, and it doesn't go away. So it's not a pleasant thing. And when it gets into the plant says, what the hell is this thing, this alien that's just come into my plant? So it has to expend energy to neutralise that contaminant. And are there better ways? Yeah, there are much better ways. There are a variety of natural chelating agents you can use. One of them, and perhaps the most powerful, but certainly amongst the most powerful, is fulvic acid. Humic acid could do it, but it can't because it's not compatible with all the sulfate-based trace minerals, but fulvic is. So you can put a little bit of fulvic acid into that equation and create a calcium fulvate or a zinc fulvate or a manganese fulvate, which is a chelated form, or you can use amino acids. And amino acids, on some of our recent work, are really quite phenomenal in terms of what they can achieve. There's several amino acids that are chelating agents. The most powerful is the tiny one called glycine, and glycine chelation can actually be shown to fully be within the plant within 30 minutes. The entire uptake is over in 30 minutes. It's so small it just goes in so quickly when it grabs hold of your zinc or manganese or whatever. So that's the idea. And kelp is interesting because seaweed, amongst its many claims to fame, is a substance called a long-chain sugar called mannitol, which is actually quite a powerful chelating agent. So you can chelate with kelp. And of course, all the trace minerals, which is all 74 of them from the ocean found in kelp, are already chelated by that substance, which is one of the reasons you get such a nice response from kelp. So calcium nitrate with fulvic acid creates the calcium fulvate. It's the most cheap way of getting calcium into the plant, the most efficient way from a cost-effective perspective of anything that I've seen. So understanding mineral mobility. Minerals vary, as we pointed. The most mobile are NPK, magnesium, and manganese to a lesser extent. The least mobile, of course, is calcium, and that's why so many crops will benefit from foliar spraying, the simple, we can make you one or you can make it yourself, chelated calcium foliar spray, and just put that least mobile mineral into the plant, into the fruit, into the seed, and watch what happens when you do that. Getting your timing right. So we mentioned one of the other things that is now understood to open that stomate is the frequency of early morning bird song, so you can tie in your foliars. You never go out in the heat of the day. It's a complete waste of time. The stomates have closed. You can't absorb very much at that point. There's an issue, and this is quite important for you to understand relative to the efficiency of urea foliar spraying, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's an issue in that in really cold conditions, foliar fertilising becomes less effective, and sometimes quite substantially. And that's why there is a need sometimes to come in with some urea and humic acid to create a stable urea humate in the middle of winter, and then you can move back into foliar spraying urea when you get to springtime and it warms up a bit. So the best time of day is early winter. You can go at late afternoon, you can go at night, and it's there in the dew to be absorbed when the stomate's open in the morning. It's just understanding those things. Always put in a microbial inoculum if you've got one, the perfect partner for your nutrition. And a really interesting concept is, there were so many things in agriculture done by moon cycles. You ploughed, you pruned, you planted based on the moon cycles, and then we said, oh no, we've got this whole new way of doing it now. That stuff's just a waste of space. Well, it's not a waste of space. We did it for tens of thousands of years, and there was a reason for that. And the finding relative to foliar spraying is that there are a time you should do it and a time you shouldn't do it, and you can do it any other time and it's okay, but there's a best time, and I'm talking substantially best, and there's a substantially worst time. So the 6 days leading up to a full moon are the times where there's most movement of moisture. Of course, that's what the largest tides are, and you're moving moisture around that plant, and that's the hot spot. All of our orchardists who do a foliar spray once a month, they tick that any of those 6 days, that's when you foliar spray. And the time to avoid is the 6 days leading up to a new moon. It's the least translocation of nutrition, so you avoid that time. It's pretty easy to do. Just mark your calendar. And so I had a friend, Rod Baker, wonderful, wonderful citrus grower, very large-scale citrus grower, kept on buying it, sometimes 2 farms a year. But whatever you talked about, he said, I'll try that. And he did. And he set up all replicated things. It was just a wonderful piece of in-farm research. And he heard me say this. He said, I'll try that. And he did. And he called me up and said, you've got to see this, Graeme. And so I drove all the way over to Mundubbera where he was, to have a look. And he bought a new farm and he planted these kilometre-long rows of mandarins, same soil type, same fertility, and all he did different on 3 rows, there was 6 rows, 3 of them he sprayed leading up to a new moon, his monthly foliar concoction, leading up to a new moon, and the other 3 rows he sprayed leading up to a full moon, and you went over there and there was this much difference, and there was this to this. It was ridiculous, one change. And that convinced me that there was some validity to that concept. It's also really productive to feed young foliage. You can take something like our 1010, our largest selling fertiliser, and spray that on a lettuce plant this big and it will go pop in 2 days and double. Well, you can't do that later. That's because young foliage can absorb much more efficiently. We have people at 2 and 3 leaves that go out real fast, just whipping out. You're only using a litre of nutrition, but you get such a response on young foliage. That's another important thing to understand about foliars. Fulvic acid, the most powerful natural chelating agent. Every bag should have every shed should have a bag full of a good quality Leonardite-based fulvic acid. And why would you use kelp in agriculture? Well, we mentioned the natural chelating agent. We mentioned actually 74 minerals derived from the ocean. We didn't mention the fact that it contains very, very complex carbohydrates, which are perfect fungal food, and most of us need more fungi in the equation. When we look at that fungi to bacteria ratio, vitamins, highest source of, and you think, well, was it good for humans to eat kelp? Yes, it is. I mean, it's the highest known source of iodine, for example, and most of us need a little more iodine, and it has all the cofactors that determine iodine uptake, so it's a wonderful supplement for humans. It's one of the reasons that there's such low levels of thyroid malfunction in Japan because of this. These 4 hormones are required for every stage of plant growth, for germination, for the vegetative stage, for the whole cell division thing that kicks in when you get to flowering and fruiting and seeding and so forth. Even post-harvest, 3 of those are involved in how long the fruit lasts before what's called senescence kicks in. So you can delay senescence, and many, many fruit growers have discovered it. You can delay senescence with 3 of those 4 hormones and get a longer shelf life. So hugely important. And the plant makes those from minerals. So it takes minerals in the soil and it makes those 4 hormones, and the organisms around its roots being fed by the plant say, I'll give back to you because you're going to look after me. They make those 4 hormones from the minerals in the soil and pump them into the plant. So it's a double hit. But the minerals in the soil aren't what they used to be. We used to cycle everything, and then we stopped and fed 3 things and took 74 things off. So many plants are not capable of their genetic potential in the absence of that mineral density that used to be there. There's one exception. There's one plant that floats around, the fastest growing plant as it happens on the planet, in the perfect balance of all 74 minerals, which gives it the phenomenal building blocks to make its 4 hormones. It's got everything, and consequently it has 40 times more hormones than the next closest plant on the planet, which happens to be aloe vera. And we make a liquid aloe vera just because aloe vera is pretty good, but kelp is absolutely wonderful, and that's your big benefit when we're talking about why you might use kelp. So good and so inexpensive as a seed treatment, because all 4 of those hormones are required for seed treatment, cytokinins particularly, but all 4 to kickstart and to start a crop off. And it's so simple to do a kelp seed treatment, and it's so inexpensive that it's just one of those biggest bang things that you want to look at. That's just an ad for what we consider to be the best kelp. I had a South African professor who came to my course who owns half of a kelp company, got drunk. Not my fault. It was my wine, but it's just because some people had donated me 2 bottles of this beautiful wine. So we had that over a meal. We had a bottle each. So it was, we're starting to get a bit garbly at that point. But he said to me, look, I loved your course. I'm going to tell you a secret. I said, don't tell me a kelp secret, because I sell kelp in most of the countries you do, and I'll use it if you tell me. And he said, you did a good job, so I'll tell you. I bet he regrets it now, because I told him I was going to use it, and I have. He told me that if you put 3 kelps together in a specific ratio, it will outperform any kelp you've ever used. We did. We formed a soluble powder called trikelp, and we guarantee that it will outperform any kelp you've ever used till you get your money back, and we have never given back the money in 57 countries. So that was a great night out, and quite a good investment in those 2 bottles of wine. It wasn't intentional, though. So, of all the things, and I've formulated all 294 of our products and all of our health range and animal health range and so forth. So I played around with a lot of inputs, and my favourite, and I just think it's kind of a no-brainer in Broadacre because it's the cheapest as well, is this substance called tricontinol. Who's heard of tricontinol before? Quite a few of you, but only 20%. So tricontinol is the first ever fat basically. It's a fatty acid that's found to be a plant growth promotant. They didn't even know that could happen. It was isolated in the outer waxy coating of the lucin plant, and you can actually make your own if you want to lacto-ferment lucin, because lactic acid can make it available, and I'll teach you later how you can do that. Or you can buy it, and it's $2 a hectare. You're using 2 tablespoons a hectare. It's super concentrate, well, at least ours is. Some people dilute it, but it's 2 tablespoons, that's $2 a hectare. And basically, if you were to dream up the perfect plant growth promotant, what you would dream up is something that affected every aspect of photosynthesis, rather than something like gibberellic at the speed, cell division, gives you a lanky plant, and if you haven't got everything else to support it, you've got double of nothing. The Brix level halved, you've got twice as much with half the Brix level, and what's the value? You'd choose something that basically increased chlorophyll density, that increased stomata opening, that increased the phosphate-based enzymes that produce sugar. And that's exactly what tricontinol does. I've not found something comparable. It is ridiculous. Try it for yourselves, $2 a hectare, and see what you think. That's my advice on that one. I better keep moving. So really good research, like when it was first discovered, 37% increase. And this is, 2 tablespoons, 30 mils per hectare, 37% increase in chlorophyll, which is pretty important to say the least. So we're just going to change over and get on to the presentation we're supposed to be on, and I might tell you a little joke in the mean, because it's going to take a minute apparently. I might tell you a tame joke. I might tell you an Irish joke. 3 bridge builders, not builders, bridge painters, just like Paul Hogan on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You painted, you got to one end, you started again, it took several years, and these 3 boys in their sort of mid-40s, going through what some would describe as andropause, that sort of midlife crisis. But they're mates, and there's an Australian, his name's Bruce. There's an American whose name's Hank, and there's an Irishman who, of course, is called what? Paddy. And they've got the spot where you can walk up the stairs on the top of you've got a lift that goes up, and you walk on these stairs, and there's a platform, and you've just got the most spectacular view you've ever seen over what is the most beautiful harbour in the world. And they go up there every morning for their smoko. And so they're opening their smoko, and there's been a bit of grumbling about, problems in their marriages and things like that. And they've got sort of a little bit in that grumpy stage that some men get into, probably hormonally driven. But anyway, they're sitting up there chatting, and Hank opens up his lunchbox, pulls apart the greaseproof paper, pulls apart the sandwich, and there's the favourite American spread, peanut butter and jelly, or we just say peanut butter and jam. And he looks down and says, I've had this. We've got the old school model where my wife's the homemaker and I'm doing this stuff to supply to make that thing work, and she makes my lunch as a deal. And I've had this every day for 22 years, exactly the same lunch. And it's sort of symbolic of how kind of boring and predictable the whole relationship's got. So what I'm going to do over this next week, I'm going to put every hint possible out there to my wife without saying outright. I'm not going to say I want a sandwich, because that means there's no communication. She's got to pick up on it. I'll put everything out there. And next Monday, this is Monday morning, next Monday, if I open that sandwich and there's same things there, I'm jumping. And the boy said, what? You're going to kill yourself? He said, yeah, because it's my most important relationship, and it's over if that's the case. It means there's no communication left between us. And then Bruce opens his lunchbox and pulls apart the sandwich, and there it is, the favourite Australian black stuff, what's it called? The Vegemite. And he says, you know what, it's been 17 years for me, but it is the same thing every day, and I can see where you're coming from. I'm with you. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put every hint out there next Monday. If it's the same, I'm jumping. And then Paddy opens his lunchbox, and they all reel back from the smell of leek and potato sandwiches, and Paddy says, I'm with you too, boys. So it's a pretty nerve-wracking week, as you can imagine. And the Monday rolls around, and Hank, with trembling hands, opens the lunchbox, pulls apart the greaseproof paper, pulls apart the sandwich, and there it is, peanut butter and jelly. Writes a little note explaining the scenario, left there for his wife, shakes hands with the boys, and plunges to his death in the depths of that cold, forbidding harbour. Now, of course, Bruce is fairly nervous, to say the very least, opens his lunchbox, pulls apart, there it is, the black stuff, plunges down, and Paddy's in the driver's seat, last man standing, but he opens his lunchbox, the smell pours out, He says, "Goodbye, cruel world," and he swan dives to his death. Now, they have the funeral together. They've been together for years working. 3 wives are standing, commiserating at the graveside, and Hank's wife says, "What a ludicrous scenario that, why couldn't the man just say to me, 'This is what I want, for God's sake'?" And she turns to Bruce's wife, and Bruce says, "On my honeymoon, I made him Vegemite's toast on the first morning of the honeymoon. He said, 'I'd be happy to have this till the last day of my life.' And that's just what I was trying to give him." And then they turn to commiserate with Paddy's wife, and she says, "I'll never understand Paddy. He made his own lunch." Okay, so where are we? So we'll get back to what we're supposed to be doing, which is chasing the biggest bang. So we're in this ludicrous scenario where there's all sorts of kind of political things happening in terms of why would the Chinese shut down their total exports of DAP and MAP, the largest exporters by far, and create a global shortage and raise the price? Well, we don't know. The Chinese have a game plan, a 5, a 10, a 15, a 30, a 50, a 100-year game plan, and there's something going on there, but I don't know what it is. And why would they shut down all the urea exports? It's not like they need it all for themselves. And of course, we had urea compounded with all of those storms that wiped out big urea plants in North America. And we've got this crisis that's extended through to most of the farm inputs. And we're seeing these ridiculous price increases that barely makes farming viable in some instances, depending on how much you need and how much you're using. So we're going to talk about how we can improve that. We touched upon this little tool called the microbiometer that I consider to be revolutionary. Very simple. You take your test tube, you take your little sachet full of powder, you put the powder into the test tube with a certain amount of pre-measured amount of water, you stir it with this little mechanical stirrer, you then take a little screen, which is underneath here, and you screen a little bit of soil right beside the roots, right off the roots. You pull it out and shake the soil or dust it off the roots. You put it into a little syringe, somewhere there it is there, without a needle on it, just a syringe, and you poke it in the end, and you compress the 1 gram of that screen soil you put in there into a 0.5 gram, and then you put that into the same test tube you fill with water and this powder, and you stir it up with this for 30 seconds, and then you leave it for 20 minutes. Then you click on your phone or your iPad, and you get the microbiometer app, and it comes up, it's in the cloud, and it's stored so you can go back anytime and check your results. And it says what's the name of the block going to be called and whatever, and you do that, and then it says time for a test, and you push the test button, and your camera is activated with a light coming out of it. And the camera has a little square, and the microbiometer kit has a little geometric square that looks like that, and you put that down on the ground, and in the centre of that little geometric square, you take 3 drops out of the water that's been sitting for 20 minutes with the microbes encapsulated by this chemical concoction, and you put those 3 drops on the card, and then you hold your phone, and there's a square on the camera, and the camera says too far, too close, too far, and then click. The light refracts off the encapsulated microbes, and there's a complete analysis done, and you get a reading of total microbial biomass comes up on your screen. Now, that was pretty cool. That was like a game changer in its own right, because you can see what works, and that's where people got excited with cocktail cover crops, with 5 species cover crops, because that was one of the largest single drivers of major increases in total microbial. And you can see it with your own eyes. That's the important thing here. It's not talking about it, it's seeing it happen. And as I said, I can go onto farms across the globe. Where's your best paddock? Where's your worst paddock? And always the best paddock will be 500, 600, 700. The worst paddock will be 100, 120. And then you know, it's my work, the microbes in my workforce that determine my profitability. And that's a paradigm shifter there and then. That's why I consider it such an important little tool. And then, just like the Tesla car, and you walked out 3 years ago and they changed the program and you had 20% more power without having to take it into the shop, they did the same thing with this, and it suddenly started to also offer a reading of the fungi to bacteria ratio that comes up on that screen and is stored for your future reference. Really cool tool, costs about less than $300. The kits, each time with the little bits and pieces that are involved in the kit, the little pipette to suck up the water, those are $20 a kit. And you get 10 of those $20 kits in the first thing. So really, you've got $200, so you paid $100 for the kit. It is really ridiculously cheap and really, really handy. So that's an important little tool, to say the very least. There's a whole bunch of readings that someone's done there some of them are pretty good. As you can see, these pretty good soils. You'll find a lot of soils are just 100, 200, 250, but you need to be over 400, and the higher, the better. And there's no exceptions. Your best plot will have the highest reading, and you'll know, oh, that's how it works. Microbes do the work for me. I look after them, they look after me. That's how the deal works. So that's the figures. Below 200, very poor. 200 to 300, low. 300 to 400, average. 400 to 500, good. Above 500, excellent. So what's the highest reading I've ever measured? There's a guy in Canada whose family own and himself own an organic farm, and they've got a 1 hectare greenhouse, so it's completely climate controlled. But in that greenhouse, they grow on the soil, and he's done my course 4 times, and he puts everything into practice, everything. And he's got cover crops underneath his capsicums and tomatoes and cucumbers that he grows there. And he's got so many earthworms that it's just this thick on the top of castings. There's so many earthworms you couldn't count what was in a shovel. And his reading was 2,200. Guess what his turnover is on 1 hectare? $1.27 million from 1 hectare. That's the possibility. All the Broadacre farmers saw me said, oh my God, I'm buying a greenhouse. But there's a bit of work in knowing how it works. But that's the possibility, and that's what really, really good soil growing and almost pure vermicast can achieve for you. So mycorrhizal fungi, so simple. If you're growing fruit or vegetable crops, you just dunk the seedlings in, you're colonised. How do you do it in Broadacre? You put it on the seed. Often you perhaps can't afford the full number of spores to give you complete colonisation, but just getting started and investing, $8 or $10, what you get back for that $10 is a really, really good return on investment. So what do? Well, they're toxic to root knot nematodes. That's pretty cool. 10-fold increase in root surface area. They break the bond between calcium and phosphorus, deliver both minerals, go out and get immobile minerals like zinc and phosphorus, super immobile. But this very, very important one, produce plant growth stimulants, and this new finding of immune elicitation, 3 chemicals they make to stimulate the immune system, which of course also increases yield. And then this finding, so important at this point in time, that they produce a substance called glomalin that we now know is the triggering mechanism for 30% of all the humus in the soil. Well, that's about what we need to pull out of the atmosphere coming from one organism. The government should be in there paying you to put them into your soil in recognition of that research. So hugely important mycorrhizal fungi. Trichoderma are my favourite of the of the other organisms other than mycorrhizal, because they're so multifunction. They control 32. They both predate and create immune elicitation against certain diseases. But 32 diseases they can impact, including all of the damping off diseases. You want to avoid the pink seed, you put some trichoderma on your seed, because all of those diseases are controlled. But unlike the fungicide that lasts for a few weeks and then it's gone, trichoderma forms a partnership with the plant, and part of the immune elicitation response is the plant actually thinks it's been invaded, so it fires up its immune system to wall it off on the root zone so it doesn't come up the plant, and that's part of that immune elicitation process that happens with trichoderma. But that's just the start of its claims to fame. Really, really good exudation of hormones that stimulate root growth, so you get this really major root growth. Phosphate solubilizer, really voracious cellulose digester, so it builds humus in your soil. So using trichoderma to break down stubble, you've now got the benefit, all those other benefits of trichoderma, including the phosphate solubilization, after you made your humus. So it's a wonderful thing, and I'll teach you shortly how you can make your own. Really simple, really effective, really cost-effective. So we'll just talk about a few composting strategies, because this is, I've had read and heard David Johnson and his wife Hui Shan Tzu speak before. They're both microbiologists working from a university, and they've sort of developed this system they call the Johnson-Tzu bioreactor. And I'm an impatient bastard who wants to see things happen quickly, and I just didn't get in there because it's a year-long process, basically, this to create this end product. Until I was working on, thought I'd better cover this in the podcast, and looked into it in more depth and said, oh my goodness, I mean, the findings, and it's substantial, the research findings, and he's done quite a lot of published papers on it, are just mind-boggling. And we all need fungi, and we need fungal diversity. And it turns out that long-term thing, it's like a good wine maturing, particularly in those last 4 months, is where this massive fungal diversity, over 4,000 different species of fungi, end up in that end product. And they're using the concept of extraction, where you're just basically battering everything out of there, and they're using just a couple of kilos per hectare of this end product to get these really, really impressive results. So this is how you do it. You can see here, it's a strange kind of concept, really, because you have a pellet beneath that you use a jigsaw or whatever to cut out and you don't have them any more than 30 centimetres apart, is the idea with these pipes that you put in. And you can do this in a 1,000-litre shuttle, is just in a circular thing that we're looking at here. But a lot of people use shuttles and sometimes join two on top of each other to do this. And then they have the pellet beneath with these things anchored in the holes you've cut in the pellet. And you have a template on the top to keep them in place as you add whatever you're going to compost. And, it can be leaf litter and a little bit of manure, but not too much. And basically, you've got holes drilled through these 4-inch pipes, as you can see. You can see the spacings. And they say, I left it for 4 days because I couldn't believe, because once you've basically finished the whole process, you only leave it for 1 day and you pull the pipes out and that hole stays for 1 year. And you think, how the hell can that work? I didn't want to take the risk after all that work. So I left it 4 days, but the holes are still there. And so 4 days certainly works. It's basically this kind of fungal activity, because basically it's breathing, of course, air's been sucked in from the bottom and from the top and blowing out through there with this no more than 30 centimetre gap and providing all the all-important oxygen for that equation. And somehow with a fungal kind of glue thing that happens around the pipe, that cements and creates the pipe hole that stays there, and then the self-aerating from below and above for the rest of the cycle of that quite unique concept. So basically, we know that our fungal populations have been decimated. Most soils you look at, you need 50-50. You've got 90% bacteria. What hasn't been driven home, I don't think, enough in the conference to this point when we talk about carbon, is that there are 2 types of carbon. You can take your lawn clippings and wheel them over in a wheelbarrow and put them in a corner, and then you can come back with your second barrow 15 minutes later, put your arm into the first pile, and it's red hot. That's bacteria chasing easy to digest, nitrogen-packed lawn clippings with no fibre, and that's their food. 500,000 on a pinhead, tiny little creature, 5-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, closest ratio, most nitrogen in their body of any living thing, 17% of that body's nitrogen, so they love nitrogen. And they've come to get this beautiful source. And so you've got a completely bacterial-dominated compost at the end of 3 months. You put it on your veggie garden at the rate of 60 or 100 tonnes per hectare, because you can. It's just a veggie garden. And it turns 3 shades darker. And 6 months later, you come back and the 3 shades darker are back to the same colour. That's called active humus, produced by bacteria, that oxidises and returns to the atmosphere. It's not stable. And that's what hasn't been driven home in terms of the importance of the fungi to bacteria ratio. Fungi are a whole different story. They'll take some bacterial-derived humus, they'll make some themselves, they'll tie that into a clay humus crumb, and they create the all-important stable humus that's been shown to last for 35 years minimum, and some say much longer, in your soil. The greatest composting science finding comes from the Austrian researcher Siegfried Lübke, who found you add 6% of a friable clay-baked soil into your compost, and that phenomenon happens in the compost. The humus you created will be there after you've gone from that compost, and that's one hell of a breakthrough in terms of creating stable humus. So understand, we need to have fungi back, we need to have strategies, and we need a tool that can measure whether those strategies are working, because fungi are the planet savers. And that hasn't been driven home, and now it has been. So that's basically the story. Now, this is just one that we made, I think. I'm not sure if that's ours or not. It's not? No, it's not. But
capping the pipes?
Yeah, so your caps, sorry, good, thank you. So it clearly helped us me make the first one up there. We made it together. You cap those pipes. It's really good to buy them with the caps, which of course you can buy from the plumbing shops or wherever you're buying it from, or the irrigation shops, because you don't want to fill the pipes up as you're forking this mixture in there. And when you finish, you set up a simple little irrigation system, and you give that, if it's a cubic metre, basically you give it about 2 minutes of irrigation a day. Because weirdly, one of the discoveries about this fungal diversity is that normally you're trying to maintain 55% moisture in a compost, 50 to 55%, they want 70%. And no one knew that, but for some reason that higher moisture content maintained throughout the 12-month process creates this, as part of the story, that creates this wonderful fungal density and diversity. So that's quite a finding in that context. So after the heating phase, then you can actually add in just a handful of worms, just 100 compost worms added to the reactor, so part of the story becomes sort of a vermicompost that happens. And when you finish, the end of 12 months, it's really sort of like a sticky clay, what you pull out of there. It should look like a moist chocolate cake that you've squeezed at the end of that period. So beneficial not to put too many end sources in there because you don't want it too hot. A little bit of manure, but not much. But really, really amazing kind of findings. I don't think I've covered any of the research relative to, well, 55% yield increases on some of their studies. I don't know where those bottom words have gone to. But really, really worth something worth looking at. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about protozoa because most soils we check when we do a full soil life test, 10 minutes. Most soils are lacking protozoa, and there's a way you can bring them back really easily. And why is it important to have them in the equation? Because we talked about the 5-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio of bacteria. Well, protozoa are 30-to-1, and their role is to graze, as they call it, to constantly eat bacteria. And so one watermelon-sized protozoa is eating 10,000 pea-sized bacteria, to give you a sense of proportion on a daily basis. And what does that mean? Well, you've got 30-to-1, and you're genetically keyed, so I've got to balance out my carbon. I eat 6 5s makes 30, but I only want 1 nitrogen. So 5 times you go, and you spit out into soil solution, either in the ammonium form or sometimes in amino acid form, and the plant says, you beauty, and that's a hugely integral, important part of how you can cycle nitrogen in the system. Protozoa have to be there to do it. I'm on a ginger farm. People are saying, we've taken out a field day out there, and people have never seen ginger grow. It's this hugely amazing crop, and so such a high dollar value crop. And people are saying, well, how much water is that? Yeah, I've got to fertigate twice a week. I've got an overhead irrigation twice a week if it's dry. And they said, what about nitrogen? Yeah, I put 30 to 50 kilos every time. And I'm thinking, what? When you're doing your leaf test, you're putting as much as 100 kilos of N a week into the 6-month crop, way more than what ginger takes from the soil. And we're doing your leaf test and it's not there in the leaf. Where the hell's it gone to? I said, look, I'll shout you a soil life test. $300. And so I did. And basically, there were no protozoa. He'd used methyl bromide before he started working with us and wiped out everything, and we'd never gone back and repopulated. So there were the highest number of bacteria I've ever seen. They eat at the table first. They would take it, all that nitrogen he's feeding them. The crop wasn't. I said, you've got to get some cycling happening, and you need to make a protozoa tea. And it's real simple. You just take loosened hay, you take molasses, and you take fish. They love liquid fish. It's got all of the 3 food sources that they go crazy on. And for 2 days, not 1 day, you've got to have a bubbling, aerated system. It's pretty simple to do. You make a protozoa tea. And if you do it right, it's like sardines. You can see it so clearly under a microscope because they're much bigger creatures. I said, you've got brewing gear here. He said, oh, can you do it for me? And I said, we don't use it. I had the field day here. Okay, then we'll do it, which was true. We had been generous enough to let us have the field day there. So lucky we did because we brew it up. We have a 3,000 litre tank, brewed it all up. And then the microbiologist takes it into the lab. Jeez, there's no protozoa. How could you get that wrong? Pretty simple. Loosen molasses, fish, 2 days, you're done. Nothing. So we do it again. Nothing. I ring the lucerne boys up on the downs. What have you done different? Oh, we had lucerne flea this year. The insecticide kills protozoa. So we had to pay $5 more to buy organic lucerne, or you need to know the history of that lucerne. And then we had the tank full of protozoa. I took it over to Ken's. He put it through his irrigation. And within 3 weeks, he's reduced his nitrogen by 66%. And we're doing leaf analysis to make sure he's not underdoing it because he hadn't cycling back in the picture. That's how you can work with a natural system and have it work for you, which is pretty important when you see the increase in the price of urea. So that's just the lucerne. 2 days, good aeration, 2 days, lucerne, molasses and fish. Now, I had a grape grower from the Coonawarra come in and say, hear a half-day talk I was doing in this region, and, well, not in this region, but, somewhere around here. And he said, I'm going to do that. I've got a brewing tank. I'm going to try it because he checked his earthworms, and, you're chasing this holy grail of 25 earthworms per shovelful. He had 1 earthworm per 11 shovelfuls is what he counted. So he said, I'm going to do this. So he made a protozoa tea and put it out. 6 weeks later, that's not long. Was it 6 weeks or 8 weeks? Either 6 or 8 weeks later, he goes back and does a recount, and he's got 11 earthworms per 1 shovelful. Now, just so you understand, 1 to 11, 11 to 1, that's a 10,000-fold increase And where the hell did they come from? They only subdivide every 6 weeks. You couldn't grow them in that time. Put it there and they will come. It's their favourite food source is protozoa. You want to build earthworms? You put out a protozoa tea and watch them come for it. And that's his experience. And he came down and did the 5-day course on the strength of the changes he saw with all those castings and all that aeration and all the beautiful stuff that earthworms bring to the equation. So talking a little bit about beneficial anaerobes in the form of, we've talked about you can make them yourself from rice as a starting point, then grow it out on milk and then brew it up in tanks, these lactobacillus teas. This bloke was the first to realise why is it that lactobacillus, and there are many, many strains of them, why are they everywhere? They're in our gut, they're on our skin, they're on every plant surface, they're in every soil. Nothing's accidental in a perfect blueprint called nature. What are they doing there? So he started research and said, oh my God, these beneficial anaerobes, it was all about beneficial aerobes, but these beneficial anaerobes are nitrogen fixers, phosphate solubilizers, potassium solubilizers. They produce stimulants to stimulate plant immunity and they enhance the uptake of other minerals and all sorts of things happen. So he produced a product called EM, which is massive in Asia and very small in most other countries. Now there's an American professor who worked with him for 15 years who went home to take EM to the US and then spent another 3 years and added another 6 species to it and then launched it as his own product. It's not actually called BAM over there, but I went over and saw what he was doing, particularly the hay story. That was just amazing. You know, normally you've got to have 15% moisture to bale up your hay. You can have 70% moisture, spray this thing on and it ferments inside there. And he showed me a demonstration of a cattle yard with the cows outside because they knew something was going on. He must have shown other people previously. And he's got all the favourite foods, bins full of lucerne, of corn, of molasses, of all things. And at the back is one of these bales that he baled at 70% moisture with this stuff on it that's been split open. The cows are all mooing. He opens the gate. They run past their favourite foods, all of them, straight to that bale. And I said, I'm bringing this stuff in. That was my turning point. It was an amazing thing to see. I should have filmed it and didn't. So we started importing it, selling it as BAM. We've got 15 microbial products. It was our 6th. And then I realised that you can brew it so easily on farm. And my management team, I've got a 3-man management team. And, you know, I own the company, but they're my team that sort of are my advisors and look after the thing when I'm not there. They said, this is ridiculous. I said, I'm going to teach people how they can do it themselves. They said, you are a madman. Who would do that? This is it, you know, we'll lose all of our sales. You can make 10 to 1. You can even make more than that, but 10 to 1's most efficient. And I said, I'm doing it anyway because I'm trying to look after farmers. And so I did. And it's one of those examples of give and you shall receive because BAM is now our #1 selling product in 57 countries. People who never would have used it now can do it so inexpensively, 20 cents a litre. And it's the easiest and most user-friendly thing you'll ever do. So you're taking, you know, whatever size tank you want, and it's going to be that anaerobic model that you saw with the hose coming out of the top into the airspace at the top. You put your 100 litres of BAM, for example, in a 1,000-litre shuttle, 50 litres of molasses. You've got this much gap in the top. You've got an ordinary garden hose, so it's a 15 mil or whatever the size drill hole that you drill in, and the other end of the garden hose goes into a 2-litre bottle of water strapped with a couple of plastic straps on the metal frame of the 1,000-litre. You fill it up, and that's the only thing that's going to take you any time. Pretty easy to put the other ingredients in, and then it's 10 days in summer and longer than that, sometimes as much as 3 weeks, for it to subdivide every 20 minutes and fill the entire tank with this product that then stays stable for 2 years. And you can put it with anything that you're doing at 20 cents a litre. It is just ridiculously effective. Just try it and you'll see what I'm talking about. So what sorts of things it can do? Well, there's nitrogen fixers in there, there are phosphate solubilizers in there. It's an amazing compost accelerant you can do, which is my favourite form of composting now, BAM composting, where you make your pile, your carbon, your nitrogen, your manure, your carbon base, your manure layer, and each layer you put in some of this inoculum with water, so it's nicely drenched through it. Then you cover it completely and you leave it sitting. You stir it together first, mix it all up. You only turn it that once, mix all the layers together that have all been nicely inoculated. You put the plastic over the top, you have some logs or some tyres, except snakes get in the tyres, or you put some concrete blocks. And 2 months later, you come back and you've got this beautiful compost, which is actually outperforms, I find, any other compost. And it's so simple. You know, it's for busy farmers, it's kind of like the perfect way to compost. Suppressors can be used for disease control, can be used to detoxify chemicals out of the soil. Wonderful manure ponds because it's anaerobic, so they just turn the entire thing. You don't have to put much in there because it just grows in there because it's anaerobic and it loves these stinking, stagnant ponds and turns the entire thing into a liquid fertiliser. Wonderful seed treatment. That costs you about 5 cents per hectare when it's 20 cents a litre and you're using 10 litres per tonne. Do the sums. It triggers germination to the extent that people have used it. The Chinese have got 2 papers on it, specific to basically pouring out high rates. We're talking 100 litres per hectare, and everything germinates. Like normally seeds just germinate when their time's right, but this is such a germination enhancement that you can wear out your weed bank, which is a pretty cool concept. You can exhaust your weed bank because they all pop up when they wouldn't normally have popped up, and then you turn them in before they flower and use them as a green manure crop. That's pretty cool. 5 minutes. Okay, cleaning stock water. It eats algae. It's also a very good probiotic, which we're not allowed to say, but I'm telling you that. Removes problem smells. It's used, EM's used all over Asia to take away. I mean, you know EM, that's what bokashi is. You can put all the smelly things, they don't go smelly. They're just, it's fermentation rather than putrefaction is the process that we're looking at there. Put a cupful into a septic tank or a couple of cups and you've cleared your septic tank. Dogs, I love them, you pat them, sometimes your hand stinks for 3 hours. You spray it on your dog, there's no smell. You can put it under your arms and there's no smell. So it's got quite a few benefits. We actually sell it to a Sydney-based company who put essential oils with it, and it's a cleaner, it's a living cleaner. You spray it on your bench, spray it on your bathroom, and it eats the stuff off. So there's lots of uses for this do-it-yourself concept. So last few slides, I've got five minutes. Chasing the biggest bang. So we stabilise all nitrogen inputs, and the simple way to do that is the inclusion of soluble humic acid granules, which create a urea humate or an ammonium humate and stabilise that end source. So, you don't have to do long-life urea. You can put humic acid with it, and you've created a similar and much more beneficial effect rather than formaldehyde, which is one of the substances used to create, it kills nitrifying bacteria, but it kills a lot of other things in the process with that particular long-life urea. It's vastly preferable, the concept of creating a urea humate or creating a phosphate humate for that matter. But foliar spraying of urea we've mentioned. I'll say one more time what it's about. You put urea, it's the amine form of nitrogen. You put it in the soil, the urease enzyme immediately converts it to ammonium nitrogen quite quickly within 24 hours, depending on warmth and moisture. It sits on the clay colloid with a single charge, it's positively charged cation. Nitrifying bacteria, that's their role in the schemes of things. If there's warmth and moisture, come woofing in, because that's what they like, and they convert that ammonium nitrogen to predominantly nitrate nitrogen, and in it goes with water into your plant. And if there's lots of it, there's lots of water and lots of problems. And now it's sitting in the leaf as a nitrate that needs to be converted to a protein. That's what we want. Protein drives immunity. Protein's what we're paid for, and so forth. And it's sitting in that leaf, and that's a 3-stage process. And the big energy-sucking, most energy-intensive is something called the nitrate reductase enzyme drives it. It's the conversion of a nitrate to the first stage of protein. And the first stage of protein is called an amine. And then it's click amino acid, click protein. What would happen if you bypassed that whole very inefficient technique with all of the volatiles and leaching that's part of that nitrification process, and you just foliar sprayed the amine 12 times more efficiently onto the leaf surface, and it went amino acid protein? Would that be better? Yes. Except for the fact that it's not so efficient in super cold condition. It's the only way to utilise nitrogen effectively. You're using 15 kilos per hectare on average, sometimes 10. It's certified and organic in Cuba. It's an organic substance. It just wasn't mined organically, so they're a bit more pragmatic. You're only allowed 10 kilos a week on vegetable crops, but everyone uses it. And you say, oh yeah, but it's urea, it's synthetic fertilizer. No, it's not. Urea is a natural compound. We just didn't harvest it naturally. Urea is actually a really good thing, used correctly. So, boosting, understand you've got 74,000 tonnes of nitrogen gas above every hectare, and you're supposed to be getting some of that stuff. And how do you do that? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. And improving recycling of nitrogen in the soil, and one of the key players is protozoa. So, although we'll talk about it now because I thought there were other slides on it, but basically that nitrogen fixation story is about nitrogenase, the enzyme, and that enzyme's made from molybdenum. Now, 80% of the soils we test globally are lacking that tiny amount of molybdenum that's required. And I mentioned the concept that I see all the time in the field that, clover has got, legumes have got such wonderful benefits, releasing acids that break the bond between calcium and phosphate and deliver both those minerals to the legume or to the host crop, the crop that's with the legume, the ryegrass or the corn crop or whatever. Number one. Number two, of course, fixing nitrogen, supplying the host plant with the nitrogen as well. And third is this acid exudate stimulating fungi. Fungi accumulate, they love legumes, that's the whole deal, but that only happens if you've, for a start, got nodules, and if you haven't, why haven't you? That can be other things, but usually it's a lack of sulphur, and sulphur is so widely deficient, it's insane. And we used to get it for nothing. It came down in the rain, then we had acid rain, killed waterways, killed forests, and so we said we're banning sulphur emissions. And it's now thought that we made a mistake in banning 100% sulphur emissions, because what we now understand about sulphur is that all of the resilience factors in a plant are sulphur-driven. Hundreds of sulphur compounds are involved in driving a resilient plant that can fight its own fight. And would it be far better to have cut out 70% emissions and continue to get our free sulphur, because we need that resilience more than ever in the face of these climate change extremes. Abiotic and biotic stresses are going crazy, and sulphur is used to combat all of those. And sulphur's lacking everywhere. It's crazy. You can't make protein without sulphur. You know, 2 amino acids, the most important amino acids, cysteine and methionine, are made from sulphur. So really, really important. And the interesting thing is you put out gypsum, you put out elemental sulphur, you get this greening sometimes that paints the paddock green like urea, and it doesn't happen with the gypsum. You think, how the hell's that working? And then I finally saw the paper that the stomates, not just to suck up CO2, the stomate sucks up sulphur dioxide, and when elemental sulphur is converted to the plant available form, there's quite a substantial percentage of gas, and the stomate says, yes, thank you, and you paint your paddock green, and I love elemental sulphur. It's a wonderful thing. You want natural phosphate to work well, you want guano to work well, you put elemental sulphur with it and watch what happens. You've got the acidity to kick in that citrate-soluble component to give you that kickstart on a crop. I think I've got to wrap up now. I'll just see if there's one more slide. Just techniques to unlock your frozen reserves of phosphate as far as the peak content goes. Legumes, of course. I'll just finish off that last thing. So number one, you've got to have nodules. Number two, they have to be red inside, that pinkish red colour inside. And half the time I walk paddocks, they're not. And what that means, and what you need to understand about, is not just that you're not fixing nitrogen, because you're not, because that leg hemoglobin, the red colour, is only present when you're fixing nitrogen. But what happens is when you're fixing the ammonium form of nitrogen and the plant's uptaking, your legume is uptaking ammonium nitrogen. I mentioned the phenomenon where you release a cation. When you take in an ammonium, which is a cation, you have to release it, and you're not going to release another food, so you release hydrogen. That's the acid exudate that breaks the bond between calcium and phosphate that feeds the fungi, and that's not happening if it's not red inside, because you're not taking ammonium and spewing out hydrogen. People don't understand this, so you've got to have red inside, and most of you have. Well, not most of you, but several of you won't have. And why haven't you? Because you didn't do molybdenum, and to a lesser extent sulphur and boron. That's the three minerals that you need to address and be aware of that determine that red colour and all the benefits that go with it. So thanks for listening.